Turns it over. Livingston, Iguodala, back to Livingston, throws it down.
When you talk about the Golden State Warriors dynasty from 2015 to 2018, you're probably going to look at Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green as the main catalysts of 3 championships.
As Joe takes that trophy.
But the unsung hero of that story was a guy named Shaun Livingston, a bench player who didn't get a lot of attention but was equally important to those titles. Yes, he's not a star player putting up great stats or hitting big shots, but there's a reason why Shaun Livingston was the secret to the Warriors dynasty. Shaun Livingston entered the NBA as a future superstar. He had the potential to be one of the greatest point guards of all time because he was a 6'7" playmaker who had the physical tools and the passing skills of an all-time great. Livingston was also coming out of high school, entering the NBA at a very young age. So there was a good chance he was on his way to stardom, considering the LA Clippers were willing to be patient enough with his development.
Shot clock in 1-2, coach. Oh, Livingston beats the shot clock buzzer.
But in his 3rd year in the league, while he was averaging 9 points and 5 assists at 21 years old, he landed awkwardly after a layup attempt. He dislocated his left kneecap and injured almost every part of his knee. For most players, this was an instant death blow to their basketball career. But for Shaun Livingston, it was a challenge he needed to overcome. Sure, the injury robbed him of his speed and athleticism. There was no way he was ever going to become an all-star after that incident, and the journey back from the injury was a long and painful one. Livingston had stops with Miami, OKC, and Washington after coming back from the injury. However, he played a combined total of 48 games in 2 seasons before he moved to Charlotte, where he reinvented himself as a backup point guard.
Henderson around, who's at the small forward spot. Shaun.
He moved from one team to another in a span of 4 seasons until he signed with the Golden State Warriors in 2014. By that time, it had become clear that Livingston was never going to live up to the hype when he entered the league at 19. The injury had cost him a lot in his career, and it was impossible for him to suddenly turn into an all-star. But instead of trying to become something he could no longer be, Livingston reinvented himself and focused his energy into becoming the ultimate backup point guard for the Golden State Warriors. Now, when it comes to the Warriors dynasty that started rolling in 2014, that team had a lot of good pieces. The Splash Brothers, Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, were the key ingredients. But guys like Andre Iguodala and Draymond Green were beloved members of that core because of their defense and playmaking. And there was Shaun Livingston, a key member of that underrated Warriors bench.
Knocks it away. Picked his pocket. Running with friends. Drop it to Livingston to hammer it down.
When people talk about that 2015 Warriors championship team, it's hard not to talk about what Curry and Thompson did. On top of that, it's harder not to talk about how many 3-pointers that team made. But the weird part is that Livingston was neither a star nor a 3-point shooter. Still, he had a good run with that team, becoming arguably the most important piece on their bench other than Iguodala. What Livingston brought to the table was his steadiness as a backup point guard. For all his greatness, Steph Curry was always a bit too loose with the ball. He likes speeding things up and making flashy passes and plays that can lead to turnovers. Of course, because Curry likes running around the floor an entire game, he needed a good backup who could lead the second unit and keep things calm and steady. That's what Livingston was for.
Not matching the aggressiveness of Golden State. Livingston will shake and bake and puts it in.
With all his athleticism and quickness gone, Livingston learned how to play the game at a slow pace. He didn't do too much or try to do more than what was required of him. Instead, he simply read the game well, while focusing on playing his role as a facilitator and defender. That was why you didn't see him running through screens and spotting up on the 3-point line to hit 3-pointers. Throughout his entire Warriors tenure, he only shot 24 3-point shots and made 3 of them. So if that's the case, what was his purpose on the offensive end if he wasn't facilitating? Well, he was a master of one move: the mid-range game. Realizing he needed to distinguish himself from other point guards to stay in the NBA, Livingston honed his mid-range shot to such a degree that it was impossible to guard him.
Still on the ground. Got it to Shaun. He backed it in.
Using his long arms at 6'7", there weren't a lot of guards capable of defending him. That's why he made it a point to focus on finding his spots on the floor to pull up for a mid-range or hit a fading shot from the post. And playing for the Warriors allowed him to do that. The thing about this system is that Steve Kerr likes to make his players move the ball around. Point guards did not hold onto the ball the entire time because they were passing the ball a lot while allowing cutters and shooters to move and find their spots. So, while Curry, Klay, and even Durant were finding their spots on the floor, Livingston was trying to get as close to the basket as possible to get high percentage looks. Once he was in his spot from the mid-range, it was over. Shaun Livingston shot 52% from the field during his run with the Warriors. Before that, he was shooting 46.6% from the field. That's because he focused on only a few things on offense and only attempted the shots he knew he could make. In most cases, that was the mid-range shot over a smaller defender. When he was shooting those mid-range shots, he sometimes looked like Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant with the way he used his footwork and post moves to get a clean look, and because he had a very high release point that no one could block, it was impossible to defend his mid-range game.
Livingston will shake and bake and puts it in.
But more than that, Livingston was also a master of cutting. Whenever he wasn't shooting turnaround shots, he was cutting to the basket and waiting in the dunker spot for a pass. If you looked at what Gary Payton II has been doing for the Warriors as a cutter, that was the same thing Livingston did years ago. He knew how to take advantage of the attention the superstars were getting to find an open lane where he would cut and dunk the ball. In his own words, Livingston called himself a cerebral player, a guy who likes to think deeply and find ways to counter defenses. If he wasn't calling plays from the point guard spot, he was attacking, cutting, and crashing the offensive board from the shooting guard or small forward positions. In his own words, he was being a basketball player because he had to do whatever he needed to do to stay occupied and active. Of course, another intangible that the Warriors also loved about Livingston was his stability. As mentioned, he was Curry's complete opposite because he liked to slow the pace down and operate inside the perimeter instead of trying to do a bit too much from the outside. The game was different when he was on the floor, forcing opposing teams to completely change their defensive schemes to accommodate Livingston's talents. For instance, during the first round of the 2016 playoffs, where the Warriors faced the Rockets, Curry was limited to only 2 games because of an injury. Livingston filled in his role and averaged 13.2 points and 4.8 assists while shooting 58.7% from the field.
Instead, slips it inside. Livingston again.
What was more impressive was that he averaged only 1.2 turnovers the entire series. The Rockets were built to defend Curry, but they weren't ready for what Livingston brought to the table. Another example of his importance to the team was Game 1 of the 2016 Finals. Curry shot 4 out of 15 from the field and scored 11 points in that game. But one of the reasons why that team won that game was Livingston, who scored 20 points off the bench, all while hitting 8 of his 10 shots. So, while he was not a good three-point shooter or a star-level player, he was the perfect example of a role player who knew his role and mastered it. Meanwhile, a lot of role players try to do too much or aren't willing to stick to the roles they've been given. In Livingston's case, however, he respected his limitations and played into his strength. That was the very reason why the Warriors won 3 championships during that time. This team had players who knew their roles down to the very last letter, and Livingston was the guy who led the charge. If you have a veteran point guard who's willing to play off the team's superstars and doesn't demand a lot, you're bound to have role players who are also going to work just as hard at mastering their roles. So, even if Livingston wasn't putting up star-level numbers or doing jaw-dropping plays that got the crowd riled up, his demeanor and mastery of his role changed everything for the Warriors.